got a selection of good things on sale, stranger. What are you buying? What are you buying? What are you buying? What are you buying?
Resident Evil is one of the longest running video game franchises that has always been a core part of the survival horror genre. A series that's well known for scaring players to death with its claustrophobic and intense atmosphere, zombie or monster-infested spaces, limited item usage, and sometimes goofy writing.
Wow, what a mansion!
It has often been the gold standard for the survival horror genre that has iterated many different times across each gaming generation. An important franchise that has stood the test of time, as well as influencing other horror games of similar nature, Resident Evil is loved by many. But while every major Resident Evil title has been met with positive acclaim, for the most part, there are a few standouts that have marked some major influential changes for the franchise itself. And one of them, which happens to be hitting the 20-year-old mark, is Resident Evil 4. Originally released on the GameCube in January of 2005, RE4 marked a major shift for the Resident Evil franchise as it pulled the series in a much more different direction. Gone were some of the series' more traditional aspects, such as the fixed camera perspectives, limited inventory space, and even the traditional zombie archetype. These changes were made in favor of more complex enemy types, a wide array of weapon and item usage, and by far the most influential thing in gaming history, a third-person over-the-shoulder camera. This particular change would not only be felt in the franchise itself, but many of the video games that came after it, which would adapt RE4's style of over-the-shoulder combat. Whether you were on the side that embraced the more action-oriented part of RE4, or your traditional Resident Evil survival horror heart was broken by these changes, RE4 was without a doubt a highly acclaimed game for many of its technical achievements back in 2005. A fun, action-oriented survival horror shooter that arguably changed the gaming landscape. Speaking personally, RE4 was my breakout game that not only helped me get into the Resident Evil franchise, but horror games in general. As a kid, it's actually thanks to its action that I was able to build my tolerance and enjoyment of being okay with shitting my pants. Without it, I wouldn't be playing games like Silent Hill, Dead Space, Soma, or even my current favorite horror game, Signalis. It is indeed an important game for me, to the point that I even bought it across each of the different platforms that it was ported to, and most especially, the remake. So now that it's 20 years old and ready to date your daughter in college, let's see how Resident Evil 4 fares 20 years later. After the events of Resident Evil 2, in which Leon escapes the destruction of the zombie-infested Raccoon City, he ends up becoming a government agent who is now in search of the president's missing daughter. His intel leads him to a remote village somewhere in Spain, where the proper way to greet foreigners is to ask them a question. And the correct response from Leon is to roundhouse kick them. Yeah, nice to meet you too. The local population is not what it seems, and there is more going on beneath it all. It turns out that there is a hidden biological threat that's plaguing the area, and the president's daughter, Ashley, is caught in its unfortunate web, and it's up to Leon to rescue her and bring her safely back home. It's a very simple story with really nothing else about it. You have the main sexy protagonist Leon, who has to save the day by rescuing the damsel in distress, while also trying to stop the Spanish BOW Inquisition from spreading its reign of terror. Said protagonist is also very familiar with biological outbreaks, thanks to his first day in Raccoon City. Thus, he's the perfect man for the job.
Watch out! Watch out! Watch out! Watch out!
A very action movie-esque plot, and it actually delivers on the story presentation very well, despite Resident Evil's history of being overtly campy when it comes to conveying its story.
No! Don't go!
It's just serious enough that the characters feel believable, but not so serious enough that they are devoid of personality. It's the right amount of drama that each character brings to the horror-themed table that makes RE4's story feel fun enough to go through. Leon, for example, comes off as being serious and unwavering in his attitude towards the mission, but he's no stranger to a few quips here and there.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Ashley does play the damsel in distress very appropriately, but she's also very grateful and happy that she has someone like Leon to rely on.
You did good.
I'm sorry if I was... Oh, don't worry about it. Come on, let's move on.
Also, she's really good at driving bulldozers.
Leave it to me, Leon.
In the 20 years that I've known this game, I still have yet to find a reasonable explanation as to how she's able to save our asses. The cast of villains are very one-dimensional, but they're used to great effect in simply juxtaposing their overtly evil personalities against Leon's. Mendez, Salazar, Krauser, and the main antagonist Sadler are all extremely focused on being as evil as can be, but it fits the tone of RE4's plot very well.
If you become unpleasant to our eyes, you'll face severe consequences.
There's also the morally ambiguous characters like the Spanish Ikemen Luis Serra, who's got a good bit of smart mouth and sincerity to him.
We don't have much time.
What are you talking about?
I have to go back and get it.
Let me come with you.
No, you stay here with Leon. He is better with the ladies.
Damn right.
Or the absolutely sexy Ada Wong, who still makes me go, yes, despite the 20-year age.
Leon. Long time no see.
Oh, and let's not forget everyone's favorite.
What are you buying?
It's a fun cast, and I think they make for some good story juxtaposition to the normally tense horror atmosphere of Resident Evil's gameplay. Even after 20 years, I didn't feel like the plot or its characters were out of date, and all of this could honestly fit in today's stories. It also helps that the voice acting for each character is well delivered and still sounds really good.
My name is Osmond Sadler, the master of this fine religious community.
What do you want?
To demonstrate to the whole world our astounding power, of course.
A very action movie-esque plot that really fits the Resident Evil 4 bill very well, and it's still a fun thrill ride. Compared to the prior games of the franchise, Resident Evil 4's gameplay is the most fundamentally different out of all of them. Rather than adhering to the traditional survival horror formula of limited inventory and fixed perspective movement, Resident Evil 4 opted for more control and precise shooting. Leon is given an over-the-shoulder camera, along with freeform movement of his aim to better direct his shots towards specific parts of the enemy. Although it looks like it could be any modern third-person shooter, it still has a bit of classic Resident Evil to it because Leon still moves with a bit of tank control. Instead of moving sideways, Leon still has to turn whenever you move left or right. He also has to stand still whenever he takes aim. Although some might argue that this movement style is essentially dated, I've never actually felt that way because of how RE4 handles its enemy balancing. They move at a pace that always feels overwhelming, but never unfair since Leon can make good use of his aim, movement, weapon usage, proper knifing, and melee attack prompts to stem the tide. It all blends very well when you make use of Leon's kit to stop the advancing horde. It's also kind of necessary to use everything at your disposal because if enemies do attack you, it's usually a big chunk of damage, so Leon can only take a few hits before going down. I'd say that's intended in order to balance the better combat capabilities that Leon has. Otherwise, it would be a little too action-oriented, and Leon could just stroll right through the game. For me, this is by far the most important system of the game that has held up very well, despite modern games adapting a much more fluid third-person control scheme. But because enemies move the way they do, and the precision you get to have with taking them out, it almost has a fun arcade-like quality to it that feels uniquely RE4. The weapon variety is fun enough that you can pick and choose weapons to suit your preference, but not so overwhelming that it's difficult to make a decision. You have a good number of choices when it comes to the handguns and shotguns, since they all have different characteristics like having better handling, power, spread, and range. There are only 2 types of sniper rifles as well as magnums, so you don't really get that many choices for them. But honestly, they are powerful enough already, so I didn't really ever feel the need to have more options. There's also the TMP if you want more rapid fire pew pew, as well as the mine launcher should you want to try a more specific weapon. Oh, and a single-use rocket launcher should you feel the need to speedrun certain enemies.
'Tis but a scratch.
I really like the weapon variety because it's also fun to try new weapons for different playthroughs of RE4. I think every time I've played this game again, there's always a new type of gun that I held onto by the end. And if you're one for doing New Game Plus runs, there's also the various unlocked weapons that you can use. What's also cool about this system is that the guns you do upgrade will also have an increased sell value, so you can kind of get your money back if you want to switch to a different one. Since you only start off with basic weapons from the beginning and gradually get access to newer ones over the course of the game, you can upgrade those basic weapons and sell them later down the line, so that way you can afford the newer ones. It's a nice system that lets you pick and choose what you wish without needing to fully commit to a weapon that you may not like. I'm sure there's some money saving and min-max strategies out there, especially for the speedrunners, but I always enjoyed playing this game normally and trying out each of the different weapons. But of course, a gun is only fun when there's something to shoot at, and the enemy variety in RE4 makes for some extremely fun targets. The basic enemy ganado is persistent and overwhelming when they try to swarm you, and they're especially scary because they can also grab attack you. They seem basic enough, but when you suddenly realize that they've got a one-shot chainsaw, well, get ready to clench your butt cheeks as you try to avoid getting your head lopped off. As the game progresses, they start to gradually become tougher to deal with, like the cultists having shields and crossbows, to the later soldiers having armor, and special guest starring the Heavy from TF2. I think my favorite thing though is that after a certain point in the story, all of the basic enemy types have a chance to spawn an exposed plaga, which are extremely dangerous and can really hurt you. The fact that there are different types of plagas that can spawn also makes them more terrifying to fight against. It's also cool that they will sometimes dodge out of the way just to throw your aim off. The basic enemy type is fun, and the fact that they don't remain as static fodder forever makes for some really fun gameplay design. There's also a variety of other enemies in the mix as well that add a bit of unexpected twists to the gameplay, like the mutated wolves that you have to shoot very quickly and the invisible novistadors that you have to carefully aim at. The bosses are also fun to fight, and each of them have their specific quirks and gimmicks that you have to try and handle. Some, like the El Gigante, are simply bullet sponges that you have to whittle down to expose their weak spots, and some, like Salazar, require a little more precision to do so. I do wish that there were more combat-specific boss fights like the Delago at the lake, but the abundance in boss variety more than made up for it. I also really like bosses like Krauser, because while you can fight him normally by shooting him in his last phase, the fact that you get bonus damage when you knife him makes him a way more fun thematic boss fight given your first cinematic encounter with him. Oh, but while I love how good the bosses and most of the enemies are in this game, none are quite as terrifying and intimidating as Get me out of here! The Regenerator has got to be one of the scariest enemies that I've encountered in any horror game. Even knowing that RE4 is much more action-oriented, I have never been so terrified to face an enemy that will not die to standard gunfire, and their breathing sounds are even worse. The only way to take care of them is to use an infrared scope with a sniper rifle to kill each of the plagas that inhabit their body. It's a very cool take on a specific enemy and requires a bit more thinking and precision to take down. Though no matter how many years it's been, or how many times I've perfected killing these bastards, these guys always scare the crap out of me no matter what. That's enough! In terms of other gameplay aspects, there's also the escort system that you have with Ashley whenever she tags along. And while I'm sure a lot of us universally dislike escort mechanics, they're at least effective in adding more anxiety and tension to a survival horror game. That being said, protecting Ashley really wasn't that bad since she follows your every move pretty well, and stays behind you whenever you aim and shoot. It's also kind of adorable that she raises her fist in celebration whenever you snipe targets on the gondola lift, or when you shoot weapons out of the air. She can also follow commands to stay or move with you, so you do have a good bit of control over her when you need to. I've never had a problem with her controls, and she honestly feels fine to play. And there's also the segment where you do get to play as her, and it definitely adds a lot of tension since you have no weapons to utilize. It also wouldn't be a Resident Evil game without a few puzzles, and there's a small variety in RE4, but none that feel as substantial as the ones in prior games. There are some puzzles that require a bit of backtracking, but the majority pretty much have you solve them on the spot. They're fun brain teasers, but not something that really stands out in the game when you compare them to its predecessors or some other survival horror games like Silent Hill. The QuickTime events are pretty intense, but I find RE4's system to be way more manageable than other games. Despite them needing some pretty fast reaction time, I think what I like most about it is that nearly all of them only require two types of button inputs, one requiring both shoulder buttons or the other requiring two face buttons to be pressed. Oh, and the occasional single button mash. They are fun, and I like that they add a bit of heightened action and tension in between the general combat of the game, especially the first encounter with Krauser, because my palms were definitely sweating when I tried to get through that scene. Oh, and my favorite game within this game is the Inventory Management Simulator. I guess I'm part of the population that absolutely loves managing my items and organizing them how I like. Also, there is no auto-organize button, so you're forced to do this. There's also extra game modes like the Mercenaries for some really fun arcade action where you get to play the other characters, as well as the Assignment Ada and Separate Ways missions where you get to play as Ada herself during the events of RE4. It's a solid amount of extra content that players can come back to should they finish the main story. Overall, extremely good third-person action gameplay with a lot of very good system mechanics and enemy types that complement it perfectly. Definitely the most defining aspect about RE4 and what really makes it fun to play again after so many years. Resident Evil 4 was highly praised for its graphics back in early 2005. Especially when it came to the level of detail that each of the characters had. When the game was first released on GameCube, I was extremely impressed with how the graphics looked. The overall models were very good for their time, from the details of the clothing to the facial and hair textures, but I think the most defining aspect about it has to be the animations. In-game character models are able to express emotions very obviously, and you can easily see how the characters look and feel. This extends not just to the main cast, but also the NPCs as well, and you can sometimes see them writhe in pain whenever they are shot or take damage. Basic movement is well done too, and every human-type model has very lifelike movement and actions. While it definitely looks dated by today's standards, it's still impressive nonetheless, and I believe RE4 was considered to have the best 3D model graphics for 2005, and I think games like Call of Duty 2 or Fear were its biggest contenders. Though the environmental details are definitely on the choppier side. I didn't think they looked too bad back then, but by comparison to the character models, the lower resolution texture is very noticeable. It might be because the PC version has the HD texture overhaul, so the choppy environments really stand out. And I'm sure this game looked a little better back then, because it was normally played on a CRT monitor. It didn't detract too much from the overall experience, but they do become noticeable if you look carefully. In terms of RE4's overall art direction, it's an interesting amalgamation of rural countryside, medieval castle, and military that comprise its environments. The Los Illuminados cult definitely have their own distinct characteristic about them, and it's very much emphasized in their symbols and even their cult-like aesthetic, particularly the castle section. The monster designs are one of my favorites in the franchise. I like the concept of the parasitic Las Plagas infecting a host and mutating it into different types of monsters. They all look very distinct and creepy because of how they simply alter the host's body. In terms of sound, RE4 handles this department extremely well. The game primarily employs a heavy mix of eerie and tense music to add heightened tension for combat scenarios and various scenes. It's a very tense and creepy atmosphere, and RE4 handles it exceptionally well. Just like the music, the sound design is also some of the best that you'll hear. The more real-world and typical sounding objects and entities are more than appropriate in giving the environments and various scenes their atmosphere. But when it comes to the monster and creature sound effects, these sound very exceptional. Oh god, not again! Some amazing sound design that holds exceptionally well 20 years later. But as expected, despite an amazing graphical presentation at debut, it is starting to show its age. Resident Evil 4 was considered by some to be one of the best survival horror action games, and you could even say of all time. I think for all that it innovated back in 2005, many of those elements still allow it to be such a fun game to play. The mix of tense combat, enemy variety, and weapon choices give the game its legs to stand even today. But is it really something worth playing still, especially when the remake is present, which masterfully recreated and updated many of its core mechanics? I would say yes actually, because while I absolutely love how the remake handles its modern take on RE4, especially with the parry system that gives me the biggest endorphin rush every time I use it, the original for me still feels distinctly different in terms of its mechanical approach. Of course, they are both third-person shooters, but it's how each game effectively uses its own pacing to make gameplay feel distinct. While the remake feels very fast and visceral with how it handles combat, the original has its more methodical approach, particularly with the larger emphasis on slower movement and more precise aiming for enemy management. Many of its plot elements and other system mechanics remain relatively the same, but it's this specific combat gameplay approach that makes me feel like I'm still playing two separate games. But obviously, not everyone may see it this way, and this aspect may not be so meaningful for you to warrant playing its older version. If anything else besides gameplay, the other biggest difference are the characters. Most of the main cast feel like they have completely different personalities from either game, so that could be another reason to give the older title a try. But in all honesty, the best part about this all is the fact that we have access to both games. So if you're not too keen on playing the older version, you do have the remake to go to. I do still think that the original RE4 is worth playing, and honestly holds up exceptionally well. Not to mention it's available on nearly every platform right now, so it's great that we still get access to it. Now, I just wish I could play my favorite version of RE4, which was on the Wii, because shooting enemies with my own aim was way more fun than I thought. But that's gonna do it for today, guys. Thanks for sticking around. There will be more games to play and more videos coming soon, so please stay tuned if you'd like to see more. But for now, I'll see you all next time.